Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second panel of the second annual Max Stirner Symposium discussing politics and political strategy. My name is Cameron Vaziri, and I'm a graduate student at Duquesne University, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. As a reminder of our format for today, both speakers will have about 30 minutes to present, after which we'll have a joint Q&A. Please remember to keep your microphones muted during the presentations, and during the Q&A, please raise your hand either with Zoom reactions or on camera, and I'll call on you to unmute. If we have any questions? No? All right. So let me introduce our first speaker. Dr. Jorn Janssen received his PhD from the University of London Goldsmiths. His research focuses on political philosophy and its implications for contemporary society. He recently published his first book, Max Stirner and the Political Theology of Fanaticism. His current research interest focuses on the analysis of conspiracy theories. His topic today is entitled Stirner's Political Realism. You have the floor, Dr. Janssen.
Thank you. I'll start by sharing the screen. Right, there we go, right? Yes. All right, yeah. So first of all, I do have to apologize for the awful camera quality. I did some tests and it wasn't nearly as bad, but now that it's all running, it's a lot worse. So my apologies, but I don't really have a solution for it right now. So I wanted to discuss today a topic that I don't think has been discussed very much, or almost not at all, which is Stirner's political realism. The only instance of this being mentioned that I know is by Marx's original commentary, which was later published as The German Ideology, where he just acknowledges this in Stirner's work, but he writes that Stirner contributes nothing original to this. I disagree with this very much, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to give this talk, also because I think it's a very interesting subject that should be discussed. And I also want to point out that this is very much a work in progress. So feedback is always welcome, but it's even more welcome this time around. So yeah, I think the case I want to make is fairly straightforward. Also, this I have here a picture of me. This is from last year because I was in Berlin, and I obviously wanted to pay a visit to the grave. And where else am I going to show a picture like this? Anyway, what I wanted to do today is to start with Stirner's criticism of anarchism. Not only because it connects to the subject of this symposium, but also because I think it's a good introduction to, well, it's a good way of explaining its political realism. It's a good introduction to political theology, which is what we need and what will be the second step in order to explain his realist views. And then for the last part of this presentation, I want to compare Stirner's realist views to those of other realists, because I think, unlike Marx, that he has something very unique and original to contribute to it. So with that said, let's get started. So I presume that many of you have some familiarity with anarchist literature, and if you do, then you presume you know that it's not that easy to give a simple summary of anarchism. Obviously, I mean, the obvious definition would be that it refers to the opposition to the state or to authority. And this, in this way, Stirner certainly fits the bill of an anarchist. He very explicitly opposes the state and many other forms of authority. But I think he's an anarchist only in a nominal sense, or at least he's very different from other modern anarchists. And I think modern political theory is characterized by idealism, or by the idea, by the general assumption that politics can and should be shaped and conformed to certain ethical guidelines or ethical beliefs. And this is also the main red thread through this whole presentation, because this is exactly what Stirner opposes and what makes him a realist. And I'll explain this a bit further later on. But I we see this opposition very clearly when we examine Stirner's criticism of Proudhon, because Proudhon is, of course, I think, a prime example of this modern view of anarchism. this ethically driven view of anarchism. He was also the only anarchist at the time who at least wrote something, and he was quite popular at the time and still is to some extent. So this, I think, is a very representative passage from Proudhon, where he writes, "I recognize from the first that we never understood the meaning of these common as well as sacred words, justice, equality, liberty, that in each case our ideas have been deeply obscured, and that this ignorance is the sole cause of both the poverty that devours us and of all the calamities that have afflicted the human race." So there are many passages in his work like this. And essentially what he says here is that if we can resolve all the calamities that have afflicted the human race, if we sufficiently pursue these concepts of equality and justice and liberty, and Stirner's criticism to this is the following. He writes, "Proudhon, like the communists, fights against egoism. Therefore, they are continuations and consistent carryings out of the Christian principle, the principle of love, of sacrifice for something general, something alien." This sacrifice for something general, something alien, these something general and alien here refers to these concepts of justice and equality and freedom. And Stirner's main gripe with these is that it is expected that we subject ourselves to them. And this is essentially also the foundation for his political theology, or at least his views on political theology. So I have to preface this by well, one, by saying that Stirner never uses the term political theology. This is a term I use to describe it. He never really uses any term for it, and he just uses the term religion to describe anything. But I wanted to use the term political theology for the sake of clarity, and also because it aligns very well with the modern field of research that we call political theology. Secondly, also I wanted to add here this, that I gave a more elaborate presentation on this subject last year. It's not my intention to just repeat it, but it is necessary to explain the rest and to get to political realism. So I have to take out some bits here and there that are relevant. But if you do find this interesting, then I can refer you to my presentation last year, or of course the book that will come out shortly. I hope. It depends on the publisher. Anyway, political theology is a way of researching politics. So one might be inclined to think that political theology refers to studying the effects of certain traditional religions and how they affect politics. But what political theology does is in fact very different. It tries to examine secular political concepts as continuations of religious concepts. And the examples of these would be concepts like legitimacy or sovereignty or rights. And what we get from Stirner is a very unique way of examining this, because I think, at least this is what I read in The Ego in its Own, is that he presents a psychological case for this. And more specifically, he presents a psychological case for the persistence of faith. So what I think Stirner describes is that there is a sort of an affliction that we have, that we are plagued by a set of philosophical questions that we would like to have answers for, but the world cannot answer these. And traditionally, we sought these answers in religion, but through philosophy and science, it's become clear that religion is insufficient to answer these. And so at least Stirner recognized in his contemporaries that they redirect this faith or this desire to find these answers to politics. And the issue here is that what we want is to find meaning in our lives and to make our lives worthwhile and to make our actions significant. And for this to happen, we need certain ethical guidelines in order for them to be significant. You know, if you want to do something good or you want to be a hero, then you first have to have a notion of what it means to be good. And to have these ethical guidelines, to justify them, we need a metaphysical system that supports them. The problem is, of course, as Stirner clearly acknowledges, that the world cannot possibly give these answers to these existential questions. or I've referred to this as metaphysical security. That's what we would like. We would like to have sort of a sense that, you know, we have a place in the world and a reason to live and a reason to get up in the morning. But the world cannot answer these. So what happens then is that we project our own psychological dispositions onto the world, but we cannot acknowledge them as our own projections. And this, in fact, I think is the significance of this passage of the involuntary egoist, that even though all of this happens out of egoism, once we acknowledge it as egoism, then we can just as easily reject these projections, these beliefs, these spooks. In fact, that's what it refers to. We believe that they exist in the world because we want them to exist. Yeah, so examples of this modern redirection of faith, I've made a little list here. The examples of these that Stirner mentions very often are concepts like fatherland or equality or freedom, humanity, justice. These concepts may have had some utilitarian value once, but they've become deified and they are perceived as the highest goods in and of themselves. And we should pursue them at all costs and subject ourselves to them. Yeah. So what we get then, oh yeah, I included this. I think this is a quote I've included here. It's, I think, the closest we get to a definition from Stirner of his views in political theology. So he writes, atheists keep up their scoffing at the higher being, which was also honored under the name of the highest, or ethos supreme, and trample in the dust one proof of his existence after another, without noticing that they themselves, out of need for a higher being, only annihilate the old to make room for a new. So especially this last section, out of need for a higher being, only annihilate the old to make room for new. I think this refers to this libidinal desire to find certain answers in the world that the world cannot give, and thus we keep, making up our own answers and convincing ourselves that they are ontologically real. So from this, then, there is actually a fairly easy step that one can make to come to political realism. Now, I mean, it's important here to note that Stirner makes a case for amoralism rather than immoralism. So immoralism would refer to someone who would acknowledge the existence of certain ethical predicates but doesn't abide by them. So there are plenty of examples. There are plenty of thieves or rapists who, if you'd ask them, they would probably say that thievery and rape is immoral, but they did it anyway for whatever reason. But amoralism refers to the idea that there are no objective ethical predicates in this case. And so if there are no ethical predicates, well, then you couldn't have a politics that is guided by them in any objective sense, at least. So in that sense, politics is reduced to just power. Whoever has power determines what happens. And I think he makes this very clear in the following passage, where he writes, in consideration of right, the question is always asked, what or who gives me the right to it? Answer, God, love, reason, nature, humanity, etc. No, only your might, your power gives you the right. So this last phrase here is, of course, a slightly different version of the might makes right phrase, which is, I think it's fair to say that this is the credo of political realism. The answers he lists here, these are all candidates for this ethical realism that have all been rejected, either by others or by Stirner himself. Now, this, of course, is also the quotation that Marx mentions, and then Marx wrote that he contributes nothing new to it, and I think this is very wrong, especially because Stirner has a very unusual way of getting to this point. So I think for the next section, I wanted to compare this to other ideas on realism. And so to do that, we have to have some sort of overview of realism, but just like with anarchism, it's not easy to give a simple definition of realism means, because it's largely one could say a negative political theory, that in a philosophical sense, I mean, that it's a theory that is more defined by what it isn't rather than what it is. The main thing here, the main axis and the main concern for this whole presentation is the relation between ethics and politics. And so on the one hand, we have what I've earlier called idealism, the idea that politics should be a practical implementation of certain ethical beliefs that are considered to be real or objective. And then on the other hand, we have politics that is not guided by ethics, but rather by power, by an attempt to maximize one's own power, or a certain group that one represents, or to secure one's own odds of survival. That's the main concern here. Now, there are historically three names that we would associate with realist thinking, which are the exiled Athenian general Thucydides, Machiavelli, of course, most famously, and then also Hobbes. But there's also a modern 20th century revival of realist thought. This is especially in the aftermath of World War I, and as a reaction to the wild growth of idealist political theories of the 19th century, because the end of World War I was the perfect opportunity to reconsider some of these these ideas. Now, it's not my intention to go too deep into this, but there's one caveat that I think is very important to mention here, because I think when many hear the term political realism, they probably think of international politics, and this is something that, first of all, is more associated with this modern revival of political realism. It's also something I will discuss a bit more later, because I think at this point it's good to delve a bit deeper into this connection between ethics and politics and power, because even though realists say that politics is not or cannot be guided by ethics, it's not that ethics has no place in their thinking, or that they just disregard it or dismiss it altogether. I can distinguish from the literature that there are at least four ways in which morality is significant for political realism. One, and this is probably the most common one and the most discussed one, is that morality is part of what's sometimes called the context of action, or it's also sometimes called the function of prudence. It's just these realists are not ignorant about beliefs that people hold. It's just that they think that political decision makers should navigate these beliefs, that it's part of the terrain in which decisions are made. It's just that realists don't think that these ethical convictions have any significant influence on the actual decisions that need to be made. Secondly, then, the main gripe that realists have with ethics is not well, the main gripe they have with it is the universal aspect of it. It's like they are very aware that that ethical convictions exist. The problem is that it always has to happen in reality, in the political reality and the physical reality that we live in. So that confines and shapes and filters the ethical beliefs that we have and that we can even implement if we were to do so at all. And then thirdly, and maybe I should have taken the last two together, realists tend to have a bad reputation, and this to some extent also extends to Stirner himself, because, well, to summarize it perhaps a bit bluntly or a bit too superficially, but there's certainly a criticism of realism that it's some sort of psychopathic pursuit of power at all costs. And this is definitely wrong, and this is wrong for many reasons. And one is that so realists see politics as a sphere of tragedy. It's not that they don't want a utopia. It's just that they don't think it can happen. And what's more is that they often believe that these utopian ideals lead to much more harm and suffering than an acknowledgement of power politics. I mean, the big names like Morgenthau or Waltz are very concerned with keeping the peace in the international sphere. It's just that they think that it's more likely to happen if one acknowledges that states are very concerned about their own survival. There are also many personal convictions that these realists have. Morgenthau, for example, believes it's the moral duty of a state or a statesman to protect the citizens and and the civilians. And you can find a very similar moral conviction in Machiavelli, because he wrote The Prince, of course, as an instruction manual for young rulers. And this is not immediately clear if you read the text of The Prince itself, but you can certainly get this from other writings of Machiavelli, that he was very concerned with sort of a weakness, a political weakness of the Italian city-states at the time, and they were constantly invaded by French forces. And he didn't like that. He wanted better leadership, and preferably a union of these, or some sort of unification of these city-states to, not lose to the French, because it sucks to lose to the French. And then there are many of these realists are very religious Christians, which of course is also a doctrine of ethical realism. It's just that they don't think that you can implement this in the political sphere without acknowledging that it's in the first place about power. So what then makes Stirner different in comparison to the more common, more mainstream view of political realism? So I think the first one, and the one that I find most interesting, is that Stirner observes a certain tension that exists. On the one hand, there is a clear desire, a libidinal desire for ethical realism, but the world cannot give this. But as long as this desire exists, ethics, or at least this pursuit of ethics, becomes a constantly emergent political force in and of itself. That even though we cannot ever achieve these higher goods like equality or freedom, there is a very real pursuit of them that manifests in politics. There is a persistent belief that politics should conform to these ideals. Because this is certainly why the analysis that I gave earlier of political theology is relevant. That the meaning that one seeks, or one would like to have in the world, has been redirected from religion to politics. So politics itself becomes something more than simple, something utilitarian. And I think a good example of this, and certainly the example that I had in mind, is that in recent years there have been, for example, recently, maybe 2 months ago, there was a case that was brought before the International Tribunal here in The Hague by the state of South Africa against the state of Israel. And I'm not bringing this up to discuss any of the contents of this. What fascinates me, and there have been many other examples of this, is that from all over the West, many people came to protest and to make their voices heard. And what unites them, so essentially what you see is an army mobilizing, but they're all united by a certain ethical conviction, but they're not united by a certain organization. They don't share a nationality. They're not members of the Catholic Church or of a tennis club or whatever. And they also are, in this case, none of these people are immediately under threat of war. And I think this is very different. There are historical examples of this, but I think it's something that is more characteristic of modern 21st century politics. And it's also why I wanted to briefly contrast this to the idea of soft power, because it became quite popular, certainly during the Obama administration, but it is actually quite old as an idea in political realism. So Edward Carr makes a distinction that in the power that states have, it makes a threefold distinction, because states have power in the military sense, economic sense, and a cultural sense. And soft power, at least in the definition of Joseph Nye, revolves mainly around the latter two, but especially around cultural power. But it still remains in this traditional realist framework of states against states. So there's certainly a power that can be gained through a certain reputation that one has. Like, and there are many people, certainly outside of the West, who still see the United States as the land of opportunity, and the European Union has also tried its hand at soft power, but for example, through its crusade against the death penalty all around the world. Like, something like that doesn't really concretely do anything, but the attempt is to raise one's reputation, or to make a positive association, and through that, states can affect the context of action through certain moral convictions that I mentioned earlier, that in a way affects then the decisions that other states can make. But the issue here is that it still is confined to this framework of international politics and of states against states. What we get from Stirner is this individual subjection, this individual commitment to a certain higher good. And even though this obviously could lead, like the example I give, this could lead to unification of these protesters, for example. Like, many people could come together because they share a certain conviction. In the first place, it's concerns here an individual conviction. And this is also how we get to the second point that I think is quite different and quite innovative. And that is that in this game of power, which is what I like to call it, Stirner takes the individual as the base unit rather than the state. Now, this is also the moment. So it's true that in principle, modern political realism is mostly concerned with international politics, but it's not that it only applies to international politics, at least according to the literature. But there are a few reasons why it concerns itself so much with international politics, and one is that in international politics, all the players are very clear. Like, states are very clearly defined, and you can very easily measure how powerful they are, how strong the military is, how strong the economy is, etc. And this is much more complicated when you're talking about domestic politics, right? Is it individuals against each other, or groups, or institutions, or and then secondly, the main difference between international and national politics is that in national politics, there is a state that has its monopoly on violence, and so it can make a law and it can institute whatever it wants as long as it has this monopoly on violence. And so it could, in fact, here it has the power and the means to make a law based on ethics. But this is entirely precluded in international politics. Now, there are many realists who still think that ethics is still secondary to power, both internationally and nationally, that one can only pursue some ethical ends if one has the power to do so. But I think one thing we see is that it makes more sense for these realists of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s to be concerned with states. But the world is globalizing, also digitizing. National borders become more porous, and there's generally less of an association between one's identity and one's nation. In fact, the rise of, especially in Europe, the rise of these nationalists, I think, is an indicator of this national identity being under pressure through all of these factors. So the states become more porous and more blurry, and I think this is. I think
യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിൽ കുറെ ഡേറ്റാ സെറ്റ് ഉണ്ട്, അതെടുത്തിട്ട് നമ്മള്
Hello. I think this is the value that Stirner can contribute to it, because we see the landscape is changing, and so realism to an extent has to adapt to this, and we see more and more of these individual commitments and less of these predefined groups that one is a member of. Of course, it should be noted here that Stirner's concern is somewhat different than mine, because my attempt is to analyze politics as well as I can and to find all the little intricate details. Stirner is mostly concerned with rejecting all the powers over him as an individual and finding this self-mastery and this self-control. So in that sense, he is he's sort of an individual realist, and this is also what leads him to the rejection of the state rather than the belief. Just to bring it back to the beginning of the presentation, this leads him to the rejection of the state among many things rather than a rejection of the state because it is in the way of our pursuit of justice and equality, etc. I have one last slide. It's just I wanted to make a quick summary because you can see that I'm at the time limit. But I'll just go. These are the main points I think that I gave in this presentation. So the first main thing is that Stirner observes a tension between the lack of ethical realism in the world and our desire for it. This leads to this constant libidinal desire to pursue ethics in politics. However, because there is no real ethics, we are constantly, just chasing after these desires or pursuing these desires. But this effectively becomes, a means of political power. And as long as you believe that what you do it contributes to equality or freedom or whatever, then that itself is just a political force. And this in turn leads to a political realism based on individual commitment rather than these set groups, because there are many that have also applied realist thinking, not just to states, but also to companies or NGOs. But I think there isn't really any treatment of a power struggle between either individuals against each other, individuals against larger groups, or individuals against ideas. So there's I think a depth to be explored here. I'll leave it at that. I want to thank the organization of the symposium. I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to speak here, and I will give the floor to Tim. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janssen. Now for our second speaker, Dr. Tim Dowdall did his postgraduate work at the University College London and the University of Birmingham, where he received his PhD in 2021. He was awarded the University of Birmingham's Pascal Prize in 2022 and is the author of Max Stirner and Nihilism, Between Two Nothings, to be published in May. His presentation today is entitled Stirner's Union of Egoist, Political Satire, Social Solipsism, or Radical Egosystem. Please take it away, Dr. Dowdall.
Good afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where you will find yourselves today. For those of you who were with us last year, after the experience I had with my slide presentation, due entirely, I'm sure, to the technophobic wiring of my brain, I've decided this year to liberate myself from the tyranny of PowerPoint, and for the slideless result of which I crave your indulgence. I hope and pray that Hephaestus will view this kindly as a form of humility and will therefore not interfere in my current presentation, which, yes, is on Stirner's Union of Egoists, and asks the question, is it political satire, social solipsism, or a radical ego system? I'm going to be asking a series of questions in order to try and better understand the nature of Stirner's concept of the Union of Egoists. But let me begin with a statement. It is my contention that Stirner, despite the relative paucity of his written output, is frequently known, that's inverted commas, or believed to be known, on the basis of a few quotations, often infelicitously translated, that arrive to the recipient as a result of scant selective reading, the introduction and conclusion only of his magnum opus, for instance, or a refusal to engage with the primary sources at all, i.e. restricting oneself to the citations and interpretations of others. Such circumscribed, not to say purblind, reading is not conducive to a ready understanding of Stirner's thought. A good case in point of such myopic misinterpretation is the reception of the opening and closing line of Der Einzige, Ich hab mein Sach auf nichts gestellt, variously translated as all things are nothing to me, or more literally, if less euphoniously, I have set my affair on nothing, about which I have written a 300-page book, soon to be available at all reputable flea markets. Another less conspicuous but nonetheless noteworthy example can be found in the instances of spontaneously occurring unions of egoists that he provides in an answer to his incredulous critics, which comprise children playing games, two lovers joining their hearts together, and three friends drinking wine in a tavern. These depictions of egoistic union have been greeted by guffaws of derision from some of Stirner's less sympathetic readers, who ask how such everyday events can be thought to represent the exalted concept of the union of egoists. They are certainly occurrences which in themselves do not seem like ideal models on which to base a social theory for man in the modern industrialized world. Stirner does admit to these examples being trivial, but it nonetheless begs the question of why he was not willing or able to furnish a more substantial illustration of how he envisaged the social cooperation of enlightened egoists in praxis. One possibility is quite simply that his concept of the union of egoists, and by extension, the entire contents of Der Einzige, is not to be taken at face value, but is rather to be seen as a parody of the concurrent state of socio-philosophical discourse in post-Hegelian Germany. In other words, that it is a well-disguised defense of conventional wisdom, cloaked in an account of the workings out of secular egoism. It is a matter of record that although the book was immediately banned in the Kingdom of Saxony, where it was published in 1844, the ban was lifted within a week because the censors, after due consideration, concluded that it was in fact a morality tale, which demonstrated in no uncertain terms the disastrous consequences of questioning religious and political authority and undermining the secure foundations of divinely inspired morality. An announcement in the important political newspaper, the Allgemeine Zeitung Augsburg, apparently quoting the Ministry of the Interior, explained that the decision was taken because the book reads in actual fact like, and I quote, irony and striking self-refutation, thus acting as a warning to prudent readers and promoting the religiously moral view of life. Could it be then that Stirner's book is so shocking in both its content and presentation because he was attempting to reveal in vivid form the dangers of following the secular anthropocentric principles of the European Enlightenment that lead unavoidably to the slippery slope of solipsistic self-determination? Was his graphic advocacy of egoism calculated to demonstrate the unviability of unrestrained and unprincipled individualism in a Hobbesian world of omnium contra omnes? If so, it would go some way to explain the apparent naivety of Stirner's socio-political ideas, what Hartmann in Ethische Studien calls his infantile anarchism, and indeed the resultant criticism of such by Marxists and social anarchists alike. And why else, after all, would the translator of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations largely ignore socio-economic factors in his description of the association of sovereign egoistic owners, surrounded as Stirner was in Die Freien by thinkers preoccupied with the materialistic inversion of philosophy, unless it was through obscurity of detail to increase the plausibility of this Gulliverian world and maximize its satirical effect? Appealing though such an interpretation of Stirner as a Judas in the ranks of the progressive disciples of the Enlightenment may be, for those who wish to enlist him in the forces of political conservatism and religious orthodoxy, there is little or no evidence that it was his true intention to warn people about straying from the straight and narrow, even if this might have been the effect of Der Einzige on some of its more timorous or reactionary readers. Although little is known about Stirner's life, save for the excessively partisan account of it by John Henry Mackay. There is nothing to suggest that Stirner's sympathies lay with the political and religious establishment, or that he wished to further the cause of Platonic certainty. If his biography is anything to go by, he was unconventional to say the very least, as is illustrated most dramatically by his wedding with Marie Denhard, during which all imaginable traditions, customs, and mores were flouted. Moreover, the attitude of his contemporaries, foremost amongst them Marx and Engels, suggests they viewed him as a radical and indeed an oddity, rather than an upholder of orthodox values in the guise of a clever satirist. In a few oft-quoted lines of Engels and Edgar Bauer's mock epic poem, Der Triumph des Glaubens, the triumph of faith, that parodies the struggle between the so-called young Hegelians and their conservative opponents, Stirner is depicted as a rebellious extremist and intemperate champion of anti-establishmentarianism. I quote, "See Stirner too, the thoughtful moderation hater. Though still on beer, he'll soon be drinking blood like water. And if the others shout a wild, à bas les rois, Stirner is sure to add, à bas aussi les lois." He appears twice more in the poem, arguing once again for the abolition of rules and laws and flinging bales of books at the pious. If Stirner was a conservative infiltrator in the murky world of the post-Hegelian intellectual avant-garde, it was a brilliant deception, akin to that of the putative fourth mole who, like such an imaginary Stirner, never surfaced to show his true identity. A more likely explanation, therefore, is that Stirner was indeed voicing his earnestly held opinions in Der Einzige, and that the union of egoists is a serious attempt to describe human interaction in a world devoid of those rules, laws, and institutions that Stirner evidently abhorred. If this is the case, the question arises as to its adequacy as a model for social behavior and under what circumstances it can be applied to human intercourse. However, it would seem to be a mistake to view it as a normative prescription, as this would run counter to Stirner's avowed intent of abolishing all externally imposed restrictions on the unique individual. As such, it would appear to be little more than the description of a potential and perfectly natural manifestation of reciprocal relationships, as in the three examples of children, lovers, and friends, in the context of unregulated human coexistence free from heteronymous influence or coercion. But can such a form of interaction be extended beyond personal relationships to apply, for instance, to economic relations? And can it be expected to regulate discrepancies of power between individuals or groups of individuals? Are the rewards of love and compassion, which Stirner is at pains to point out, sufficiently attractive to ensure that harmony would prevail in a community of ungoverned egoists, even egoists in the Stirnerian sense, rather than in the sense of the false dichotomy of egoism and altruism? And perhaps most crucially, can Stirner's social model stand alongside the complex organizational theories that were being formulated at around the same time by his young Hegelian colleagues, which have been instrumental in the formation and/or development of socialism, communism, and liberalism? Stirner's utterances on the union of egoists in Der Einzige are relatively few and far between, which may give us a clue to the concept's relative importance in the grand scheme of things. He introduces it in the following manner. I quote, "We too, the state and I, are enemies. I, the egoist, have not at heart the welfare of this human society. I sacrifice nothing to it, I only utilize it. But to be able to utilize it completely, I transform it rather into my property and my creature. That is, I annihilate it and form in its place the union of egoists." End quote. He describes such a union as, quoting again, "my own creation, my creature, not sacred, not a spiritual power above my spirit. That is to say, it is a non-binding, self-initiated union freely entered into by two or more sovereign individuals. Essentially, Stirner's starting point is the coercive nature of the state, which he rejects, replacing its controlling structures with the free association of its inhabitants. This reflects the nature of the relationship between his crusade against sacred mythologization in general and its specific manifestation in the social arena. The latter grows naturally and inevitably out of the former as one aspect of the life of the individual egoist. Stirner's primary aim is to challenge, in good Enlightenment tradition, superstition, myth, and dogma on the basis of their hegemonic properties as much as their fictionality, in order to release the individual from their tyranny. This is undoubtedly an original and valuable contribution to philosophy. Indeed, only recently, with Harari's book Sapiens, have similar, if more moderately expressed, observations been made regarding the role of mythology in human affairs. Harari's work on the subject has, of course, had a much greater popular effect, which only serves to underline how far ahead of his time Stirner was. Stirner's anti-statism derives from his rejection of all sacred mythological abstractions. He lists God, the good, mankind, truth, freedom, humanity, justice, the people, the prince, the fatherland, and Geist, of course, as deleterious to human happiness, while autarky follows logically enough from desacralization. The blanket rejection of institutions ignores, strangely for Stirner, who was so intent on penetrating to the source of human motivation, not only human psychology and the general dynamics of socio-political practice, but also the history of mankind's achievements directly attributable to the implementation of mythology, be it in terms of civilization or social cohesion. To quote from the soon-to-be-published work that I mentioned above, myth is the answer, however imperfect, to many of man's existential problems, not least that of the gloomy consciousness of his own death. It is, moreover, the expression of the power of the human spirit, the inspiration of art and culture, the engine of human progress, and the driving force of history. Myth makes the weak strong, pain bearable, distress tolerable, suffering worthwhile, hardship desirable, the absurd meaningful, chaos intelligible, and death even glorious. Stirner, in other words, in disregarding the merits of mythology, some of which are hard to deny from whichever standpoint, runs the risk of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It is admittedly a position that has not gone unchallenged, but Harari nonetheless represents the prevailing view when he writes, I quote, "Any large-scale human cooperation, whether a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that exist only in people's collective imagination." In Der Einzige, Stirner does not use the word anarchism, nor does he call himself an anarchist, but it is clearly his rejection of the state, along with all other sacred man-made institutions, that has resulted in his being included by some in the ranks of historical anarchists, at least in their numerically lesser branch, the individual anarchists or individualist anarchists. In truth, Stirner's anti-Hegelian stance was always likely to ensure his opposition to the state, given Hegel's belief in the realization of freedom through the vehicle of the state. But Stirner's primary focus on the complete autonomy of the individual made his rejection as uncompromising as it was inevitable. Whether his implacable opposition to the state justifies Stirner's designation as an anarchist is beyond the scope of this paper, but any social theory that arises out of the dissolution of the state, as is embodied in Stirner's concept of the union of egoists, is subject to all the common criticisms of anarchism, foremost amongst them that the conflicting interests of assorted individuals and groups make self-governance unfeasible, and that it is unreasonably utopian to assume that the abolition of the state would automatically result in a world of harmonious cooperation. Such harmony, it can be argued, would require all members of the union to be both well-educated and well-balanced, i.e., sufficiently enlightened to see the benefits of non-confrontational coexistence, and mentally sufficiently stable to avoid irrational disturbances of the peace. It is conceivable that Stirner envisaged such a state of affairs on a microcosmic level only, as a way for the enlightened few to cooperate in their own realm beyond the direct reach of the heteronymous structures that dominate and shape the outside world. The union of egoists, according to this view, would be a form of social intercourse that depends on the voluntary association of like-minded, self-aware, nonconformist, well-rounded, super-rational individuals, and that results in an organic balance between the interests of the actors involved, despite the inevitable disparity in each individual's relative power. Such an arrangement would seem to preclude the existence of such common human desires and emotions as envy, jealousy, rivalry, greed, anger, and disgust, to name but a few, the effects of which may reasonably be thought to justify the imposition of a legal code, or at least a code of conduct. In other words, the world of the union of egoists would seem to rely on an unlikely confluence of ideal circumstances, even in extremely small social groups. Indeed, Wikipedia will tell anyone who cares to look that examples of stateless societies are historically few and far between, ranging from the now defunct Italian microstate, the Republic of Cospaia, a narrow sliver of terra nullius between two streams, created out of the geographical confusion caused by their having the same name, both being called Rio, with its 1¼ square miles of land and 250 inhabitants, to the short-lived South Carolina commune, which managed to survive for 6 years in the aftermath of the American Civil War, until it was sold down the river by the federal government. It is possible, therefore, that Stirner was perfectly serious about the union of egoists as a model for social interaction, not in terms of a new social order, but only in the sense of a blueprint for a group of solipsistic outsiders on the margins of society committed to the twin principles of autonomy and subversion. It would act as the basis for the association of those outsiders, if and when they chose to do so, rather than a general theory for human coexistence on a socio-economic level. There is, however, one movement that seems to espouse certain views that are similar to Stirner's, and which considers its socio-political vision to have the potential for some form of universal applicability, namely objectivism. Although it calls itself a philosophical movement, arguably its most important application is in the socio-economic sphere in its defense of laissez-faire capitalism. The following is part of a speech delivered by Harry Binswanger, an objectivist and board member of the Ayn Rand Institute, in a televised debate first broadcast in 1986 with, among others, Christopher Hitchens, on the subject of capitalism versus socialism. I quote, "Men must deal with each other as independent equals, each man being an end in himself, not the means to the ends of others. Each man must stand on his own, achieve his own values, live his own life, earn his own happiness. He does get, of course, a value from association with others. He's not a hermit, but let there be no mistake about what we are advocating. We are advocating selfishness, rational, egoistic selfishness as the proper code for men to deal with each other. Anytime you eat a mouthful of food for yourself, rather than giving it to some starving Indian beggar, you are doing that on the principle not of altruism or self-sacrifice, but of egoism. You are not born in debt to others. You have no duty to others. You are not obligated to seek their happiness. You are the owner of your own life. Your life is not the means to any higher end." The overlap here with Stirner's views on such issues seems almost total, nor is there any inherent contradiction concerning the implicit connection to capitalism. Stirner, in formulating his concept of egoism, seems to have been influenced by Adam Smith, whose magnum opus he translated. Just as Smith identified self-interest as the basis of socio-economic order, I'm sure you all know the famous quote, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, etc., that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." So Stirner pronounced, I and the egoistic are the really general, since everyone is an egoist and of paramount importance to himself. Could it therefore be that Stirner also shares in some way in the grand socio-economic vision of objectivism, that his union of egoists represents the outline of a comprehensive social theory, what one might describe as Stirner's ecosystem? Giving a definitive answer to this question is made all the harder by the obscurity of Stirner's sociopolitical ideas. On the key question of property, for instance, Ayn Rand states unequivocally that property rights are the most fundamental human right after the right to life, without which no other rights can be practiced. Stirner, on the other hand, proclaims that, I quote, property is recognized in the union and only in the union because one no longer holds what is his as a fief from any being. But the flip side of this is that, as Stirner writes, my property is nothing but what is in my power. The property question, he declares, is solved only by the war of all against all. In the final analysis, Stirner's writing on property seems highly theoretical, more like a defense of egoism and demythologization than a real attempt to establish a new social order. For instance, I quote, if men reach the point of losing respect for property, everyone will have property. This is a recurrent theme in Der Einzige, namely that disbelief imparts power to the disbeliever, that possession follows the act of disrespecting an entity's sacred status. It sounds more like a formal argument or logical proposition than a slogan for socio-political action. What is clear, though, is that in Stirner's hermetic ecosystem, one owns one's property based solely on the power one possesses to own that property. Property for Stirner, therefore, is not a right, but an expression of power, which, while difficult to conceive of in practice, is at least consistent with his rejection of the concept of rights. In this way, he differs not only from Rand's objectivism, but also from anarcho-capitalism, which likewise enshrines private property, as well as the non-aggression principle. But if property is based solely on power, what is to stop such power developing into a new master-slave relationship? In the absence of rules and laws, the only imaginable answer is the enlightened benevolence of the powerful. But isn't this asking too much, even of enlightened human beings? Rand's solution to this problem is minarchy, which would certainly seem to stand a better chance of practical success and, moreover, protects against accusations of utopianism. In objectivism, social harmony is based on, I quote, free voluntary exchange to mutual benefit, unquote, in a socio-economic arena where physical force is outlawed. Stirner, on the other hand, remains true to his pan-abolitionist principles, but with no restrictions in place, apart from the limitations of one's own power, the potential for chaos and disharmony would seem to be endless. Just as the Russian nihilist said something to the effect of, destroy the hated Tsarist regime, what comes after will look after itself, so Stirner seems to be saying, abolish the state and what follows will fall naturally and harmoniously into place. Human history tells a rather different story. Perhaps he was recognizing this when he observed that revolution replaces one ruler with another, which indicates that he may have been more realistic about the chances of ever eradicating all forms of heteronomy. The only alternative is that he really believed in a promised land, whether large or small, populated exclusively by enlightened individuals living together in unconstrained unions of cooperative harmony, free from, or at least untroubled by, the mythical superstructure of state institutions. For a thinker so skeptical of his contemporaries' social theories, and so mocking of Hegel's teleology of Geist, this seems almost vanishingly unlikely. It is more plausible that Stirner's union of egoists is, firstly, the articulation of the only possible form of association of individuals in the lawless world for which he advocates. Secondly, that he describes it, at least in a little detail and not too much, because the subject of social organization could hardly be avoided, given his background in Die Freien. And thirdly, that it was never intended to be part of a grand plan for future human coexistence, but was just a consequence of his main philosophical undertaking to reveal the true nature of sacred myths and abstractions, release the individual from their hegemonic control, and thus allow for the flourishing of egoism, autonomy, and self-enjoyment, aka the pursuit of happiness. In conclusion, concerning his concept of the union of egoists, there are two reasons to ask the question, Herr Stirner, are you really serious? Firstly, does he seriously mean what he says, or is it all just part of a parody designed to reveal the opposite of what it imparts at face value? Based on the available evidence, this question can, in my submission, be answered in the affirmative. Secondly, does he seriously expect us, the readers, to accept the union of egoists as a viable model for human socio-economic cooperation in the absence of a set of rules, laws, or conventions? The answer to this second question is more nuanced. If we are to give Stirner the benefit of the doubt, the best explanation, it seems to me, is that the concept was never intended to rival the grand, or at least grander, social theories of Feuerbach, Ruger, Hess, Grün, Marx, and Engels. Frustrated at his colleagues' failure to eliminate mythology, despite their successful, theoretically at least, eradication of the supernatural, he aimed to complete the work of the Enlightenment and eradicate dogma as well. Far from being a complex and fully developed social theory, the union of egoists was a peripheral element in this endeavor, designed simply as an illustration of cooperative egoism in action. That the best examples of this that Stirner could furnish were the common activities of children, lovers, and friends simply reflects the rudimentary nature of the concept within his overall body of thought. And finally, if I may be allowed, as a postscript, one of the things that an analysis of Stirner's union of egoists does is to demonstrate that it and he cannot be properly understood in terms of the binary concept of left-wing, right-wing politics. I'm not sure anyone tries to use this paradigm anymore, especially since the hopefully one and only Trump presidency. But the fact is that Stirner's philosophy seems to demonstrate characteristics from all over the traditional political spectrum. He is radical, rebellious, unpatriotic, anti-national, anti-establishment, anti-monarchist, anti-religious, anti-egalitarian, anti-statist. He supports private ownership based on power, and he opposes the cult of leadership. The fact is that he espouses the values of one individual, himself, his own Einziger, and opposes anything that stands in the way of that person's self-realization. This results in an uncompromising blanket opposition to all other potential sources of hegemonic power, based on the principle of the supreme importance of the I, that is unwilling even to contemplate the potential benefits of rules-based order. It leaves an impression of Stirner as a man with one big idea who never quite got round to fleshing out its practical implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dowdall. So now it's time for our Q&A. We have just under an hour left. So please raise your hands if you have a question, and remember to mute and unmute as appropriate. All right, let's start with David. David, you want to unmute? Ask your question.
No question yet. I was trying to do the clapping reaction.
Okay. All right. So anybody have a question right now? Go ahead and put your hand up. I'll go ahead and start this off, I think. I actually had a question for Dr. Janssen. A lot of my research actually deals with these contemporary realists. I was wanting to know, how should we understand or measure power at the level of the individual? Realists like Mearsheimer and Waltz have a lot of trouble defining what power is when you have at the level of nation states, where we compare things like GDP, population, military spending, and so on. How would we understand what power is?
That's a very good question. It's certainly something to think about. Obviously, you can measure the power of a singular individual in a similar way. just, it won't ever be impressive, but some people are obviously stronger or richer than others. But what this is about is that there's a certain power in the pursuit of these supposed ethical ends, and it leads people. I mean, like, for example, recently there was a guy who set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy. Like, that is a manifestation of this kind of power, of one of what these ideas can lead people to do. And obviously, if you can. I mean, we've seen many protests over the last years of people that have been united by certain ethical beliefs, and they've managed to cause billions in damage. But they're not organized by, like, there's no head on this body. It just, you know, it kind of moves by itself. You know what I mean? Or hope you know what I mean. Like, I mean, this is also something I'm working on, obviously. So I'm still looking for ways to articulate this properly. But this is, I think, quite. I mean, it's been around for a while. It's not new, but it's definitely more present now than it was previously. And that's the thing that's the thing that I was getting at. That it's just that this power can only happen because of an individual commitment to, you know, the belief that what you're doing makes the world a better place. Yeah, and then if you have many of these, then that leads to very real, concrete political consequences. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I wonder, I guess, and perhaps this could help bring us a little bit into conversation with both of these papers, and that would be, how should we understand when we have a union of egoists, these powers like interacting with each other? Do they magnify each other? Do they take away? How might that interact?
Does Tim want to go first, or should I give it a shot?
I didn't quite understand the question. You were saying how within the union of egoists, political power is magnified?
Yeah, if we understand, you know, political power at the level of the individual, and we think of a union of these individuals, how does this perhaps reinforce the political power that they have?
Well, I mean, my answer is going to be rather short, I'm afraid, because I believe that Stirner's concept of the union of egoists is such an undeveloped one that it's not possible to answer the question. And I perhaps I have a different view on this to Jorn, but I don't believe that that Stirner actually took the concept far enough to be able to work out how it would work in practice. So therefore, the question, I'm afraid, is unanswerable.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you that the union of egoists as a concept seems to be added as an afterthought, and it's certainly underdeveloped, and it's so short for such a large subject. I'm also not sure whether these, if this, like, what I'm, you know, these protests that I've used as an example, whether we should view this as a union of egoists, because if these are egoists, then they're certainly the involuntary ones rather than the voluntary ones. Like, the reason why they're there is because they believe that what they do makes the world better, or makes the world more equal or more just or whatever. So I'm not even sure if we should consider that as a union of egoists. I've actually, for the most part, somewhat avoided the concept of the union of egoists. I think there are better parts of the ego in its own than that.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Or perhaps anything that you would like to ask each other?
Well, yeah, I have a few things. But the thing that I wanted to ask Tim is the main thing, the most prominent thing, is that I know that you are very familiar with Patterson's book, and you're very fond of it. But he sees the egoist, or the unique one, as not as something that everyone can aspire to, but it's just something that only a few could. The world can only handle, I think you read something like that the world can only handle so many of these unique ones. because he sees it as an inversion of this the Kantian categorical imperative that the unique one can do things that if everyone did them, then the world would be awful. And so if you well, one, I'm curious what you think of this, but also because if you take this as the meaning of egoism, then it gives the union of egoists a very different well, it makes it very different. It would be more like something like a criminal organization or a group of conmen, possibly.
Well, first of all, just to point out to everybody that the comment about Patterson was meant highly ironically.
Yes.
To a certain extent, Patterson's book is actually to a very large extent, Patterson's book is the reason that I wrote my book, because I thought it was in urgent need of refutation, and that's what I was trying to do. Patterson's view of Stirner is, of course, of the Antichrist. Stirner is for him the Antichrist, in contrast to his own Christian belief. Yes, the union of egoists would presumably be some sort of multiplication of egoist power for Patterson, which can only be viewed as a negative. In my case, I mean, I really think that the only thing that Stirner was trying to do was demonstrate, because he was to a certain extent forced to do so by the discourse that was going on around him in Die Freien and Hippel's Weinstube and the young Hegelians generally, he was forced to address the issue. He was forced to say something about it. So he came up with this union of egoist concept. And I think that it's very, very difficult to try and drill down and work out what the implications of this union would be, because I don't think Stirner really knew himself. Otherwise, he would have given us more detail, and he would have given his critics more detail. So yeah, the union of egoists for me is a bit of a red herring when you come to read Stirner. I think, as you were saying, there are much more important things in Der Einziger and elsewhere than his concept of the union of egoists. And yeah, I certainly don't see it I certainly don't see it in Patterson's negative terms. But that doesn't mean that I see it as a particularly positive thing. I see it more as a red herring.
Yeah, but well, I wanted to follow up then. Do you think that the unique one or egoism, that it should be seen as something virtuous?
I think, again, virtue is something, it's a misplaced term. You were talking earlier in your in your presentation about people needing metaphysical certainty, and I mean, I would have to ask you the question. Yes, Stirner recognizes that, above all in his young Hegelian colleagues, who are setting up their own version of the Christian myth, only without the supernatural. But did Stirner need that supernatural side? Did he need the metaphysical certainty? My answer to that is most definitely no. There is absolutely no indication that I can find in Stirner that he required in any way any form of metaphysical certainty. He, as far as I can see, only ever poured scorn on it. So yeah, excuse me for flinging back another question at you, but I perhaps didn't answer your question very fully, but I think it's an important question. Yes, Stirner recognizes the need for metaphysical certainty in people. Does he have that need himself?
No, it's a very good question, because certainly in his writings, I agree with you. He doesn't give any indication that he needs it, which is the only thing we know about him. We don't know how he felt, we don't know if he felt besides his writing, but we can presume that these are his honest thoughts. So yeah, he definitely makes that clear in his writing. It's just the reason why I asked about because I don't think that or Stirner definitely rejects any conception of virtue, but within the anarchist literature, there certainly seems to be some attempt to view this as something good, or something that one ought to pursue, or some foundation for society. And at least I think, even though Patterson is very negative, I do think there are some valid observations that authors have also made, that egoism, we very often find in these discussions of Stirner that there's some sort of good implication and pursuit of freedom in egoism, but there's also nothing that restricts you from violence or crime, except the power of others that would stop you from doing it.
Yeah, can I answer that? Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I go? I think that for Stirner, you're talking about a better world, about people demonstrating or doing whatever they do because they think it'll make the world better. And this ties in with the concept of virtue. For Stirner, I think it is very clear from his writings, what makes a world a better world is that it increases the self-enjoyment of the individual who is doing the activity which makes his environment better, which is not out of the question as far as the demonstrators are concerned in relation to the Gaza conflict. Virtue is only that which increases one's self-enjoyment. At the same time, he tries to guard against an interpretation of that as to mean that one is selfish in a mean way, by saying that one must understand that one's own self-enjoyment involves love and compassion, that you are compassionate towards other people because it's a natural emotion that you are programmed with biologically. He doesn't express it in that way, but that's the reality. And that if we ignore compassion, as by the way Nietzsche did, then that is deleterious to our own happiness. So yeah, the only forms of virtue that there are in Stirner's world, as far as I can understand it from what I read of Stirner's, is whatever increases the self-enjoyment of the particular individual who is doing the activity. There was a discussion earlier on in the earlier panel today about why der Einzige, why isn't it just ein Einziger? Stirner, in my opinion, makes that very clear. Stirner says it's der Einzige because he's referring to himself, who is der Einzige for himself. And for everybody else, they are their own der Einzige. And that's why he uses that particular phrase. Anyway, I digress a little bit, which I'm unfortunately prone to. But anyway, if I haven't answered your question adequately, please do feel free to follow up.
Yeah, I think there are also other questions, but what I'm trying to get at is, so that libertarians believe that one's freedom should stop at the freedom of another. I can swing my arm until it hits someone's nose or right before it. And I'm wondering whether Stirner's egoism should be, I'm asking you whether Stirner's egoism should be considered in this sense. So is everyone an egoist, and should the pursuit of my self-enjoyment and my happiness not infringe on that of others? Or if it makes me happy, can I infringe on the egoism of others? Can I, for example, can I commit murder? Is murder bad in Stirner's view, or is it not bad?
He gives an example where it's not bad. So he plainly doesn't think that any rules exist in terms of values that cannot be changed or rules that cannot be broken. There aren't any rules in the Stirnerian world.
Yeah.
I suspect that, as with most of these things, most of these ideas, Stirner goes beyond what anybody else was thinking or has thought in the history of ideas. One of the chapters in my book analyzes Stirner in relation to Machiavelli, and there is no doubt that Stirner goes an awful lot further in terms of his analysis of morality than Machiavelli does. And I think that's the case with just about everything that Stirner deals with. He goes to the absolute extreme. But he goes to the extreme simply because he's trying to defend the autonomy of the individual against any possible threat. And he doesn't think through, as far as I can see, what that actually means in the social arena. So, to answer your question about libertarians, or to try to answer your question, I think that there is a lot in Stirner which is actually rather close to libertarianism, that is rather close to anarcho-capitalism. But he doesn't enshrine property rights, and he doesn't enshrine the idea of non-aggression. There's no principle of non-aggression. Therefore, he doesn't even put any sort of boundary in place to how far you can exercise your power. He does not express it. If he'd have thought about it further, maybe he would have expressed it, but in his writings, he doesn't express it. And what that means is either it's simply not thought through, full stop, or else perhaps in the back of his mind was really the idea that when the Enlightenment takes full effect and people become fully rational and fully educated and fully enlightened, which in itself is quite an idealistic, rather utopian view of things. But once that happens, people will realize that the exercise of their power should be within certain self-imposed limitations, because otherwise they'll end up in a war zone, which will not be a place where they can exercise their self-enjoyment to the maximum. That's the only way that I can envisage it.
All right, we have a couple questions from the audience, if we could. Ben, if you would like to go ahead and start, maybe.
Sure. I was unsure of who to direct this to, so I'm just going to direct it to Tim McDowdall, because he's
No
covered.
Mac. Okay, please, no Mac. I am not Scottish.
My apologies. I didn't mean to disrespect. I was wondering whether the union of egoists could be described as only a small scale thing which precludes large scale operations like socialism as inauthentic or involuntary egoist, or if there could be a desire for a large scale federation of workers like early Proudhonian anarchists who didn't reject international solidarity between smaller worker collectives. Compare what Stirner says about worker solidarity to Joe Hill, what he says about how workers are stronger together. A very striking similarity is there, I think. Stirner rejects communists of his time, but has communism progressed in a way that Stirner would support? Wouldn't any ideology be okay for Stirner, considering he doesn't care what people do with his philosophy, as he said in one of his notes? You know, he's like, you could, you know, just I'm putting my seed into the world for it to grow. I don't care what people do with it. You know, it's kind of what he said. Could someone be an egoist communist if they love that specific idea?
Okay, first of all, just to explain, I was joking about the Scots, but I am English, and there's this terrible rivalry between the English and the Scots, which I, as a Stirnerian, do not respect in the least. Anyway, back to the point. The simple answer is that Stirner was absolutely opposed to equality, to the principle, one of those principles of the French Revolution. He was utterly opposed to equality. He thought the idea of equality was derived from Christian morality, that it was taken over by Feuerbach et al., and then went much further than Feuerbach's original humane concept of what one could do with those ethics. He was utterly against an egalitarian form of society. It's difficult to know which word to use. One uses society for collections of individuals. Stirner even rejected the notion of society. He said that the union of egoists is where society ends. So the union of egoists is the end of society. Could an egoist, a Stirnerian egoist, be a communist in any form of communism we have known up until this time? I kind of suspect the answer to that is negative because of the anti-egalitarianism of Stirner. At the same time, if an individual were able to work out in his rational, enlightened mind that a communist society was the form of society where he would maximize his self-enjoyment, then the answer would have to be yes. I do, however, think that the latter is highly unlikely.
Jorn, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think Tim said it all, really. Yeah.
All right, then let's go ahead and go to David.
All right. So I guess my main question, and it's for both speakers, and I'll kind of elaborate on the question. But the main question here is, to what degree is Stirner's political philosophy just simply descriptive, and to what degree is it kind of normative scare quotes? Right. So, for example, against this objection of like, oh, his view of society is really impractical and unreasonable because there's all these conflicting and competing interests. Maybe Stirner could, or we would just simply respond, I guess, for Stirner, that this would just be how politics, I was going to say at the international level, but really at any level, actually just does operate. And then on the other hand, maybe if we're thinking of it, again, normative, not in the sense of like some kind of universal principle, but just a kind of loose recommendation or something like that, might Stirner's union of egoists, instead of it kind of being a political program, might it just simply be a kind of advocacy for like a refusal or a withdrawal from politics? Here I'm kind of thinking of like the ancient cynics. They're kind of just indifferent to power. Like they just don't care, so they don't engage in it. So yeah, whichever speaker would like to go first. So yeah, what degree is it just descriptive versus, again, normative?
Jorn, I bow to you as I spoke too much last time.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'd like to hear you speak, but I don't mind taking this one. Yeah, this is a very good question. Because I mean, I definitely find it difficult to give a simple answer to this. He is definitely convinced that he is not prescribing any code of conduct. As far as I can tell, he thinks that if we reject all the other normative prescriptions, then what remains is egoism. And he makes this very explicit in the response he gives to his critics. But then there's, of course, there's an additional question of, if certainly he thinks that these normative views should be rejected. And if one thinks that, is that not in itself a certain normativity?
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, you go on.
I want to say maybe, to add to that, the interesting thing is, I think you said something very important, which is that if you reject the normative positions as Stirner does, what remains is egoism. And that then opens up the question of whether what Stirner thinks that he is doing is just describing what he thinks will happen naturally and automatically and spontaneously if you eradicate all of those myths, those hegemonic myths that dominate human life, which would mean that the union of egoists is just his idea of how things work between human beings, if you brush away all of the institutions that interfere with our lives. If that is the case, and I think it makes logical sense, because certainly he would have avoided at all costs any sort of normative prescription. If it's the case, then I think it depends on a degree of idealistic thinking, which is hard to imagine. And it may just be the case that Stirner was a good-natured guy and basically an optimist, that he had all the right chemicals pumping around his brain. And his biography, as we know it, was such that he had a lot of rather unpleasant things thrown at him in life. And he just seems to have dealt with it with equanimity. He doesn't write any poetry about how terrible life is and all the bad things that happened to him, or the wife that died in childbirth, or the wife that left him and ran off with a laborer to Australia. Okay, that's not exactly true, but no, ran off to Australia in the end via London and ended up with a laborer, which maybe he didn't even know. But nonetheless, Stirner doesn't complain. He never complains, as far as we can see. All he does is laugh at his contemporaries. So yes, to answer the question, definitely descriptive rather than normative. And that, for me, has repercussions as far as the union of egoists is concerned and what it actually means in Stirner's mind. Because I won't say in real life, because I don't think it exists or even can exist in real life, but at least in Stirner's mind, which seems to me to have been touched with a certain innocence.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. At least I think that's what he thinks, but that or at least I suspect that, like you, Tim, that he thinks that inevitably the rest of the world will see what he sees, and then these beliefs will dissipate, and then egoism will come to pass.
Exactly.
But I have also wondered, and I'm also asking this in my book because I don't actually know the answer to it. That what if someone like Feuerbach would say, "Okay, you got me. Like, I'm believing in fairy tales. I believe in Santa Claus, but I want to believe. I like this. What then? Why should someone like that embrace egoism? He prefers not to be an egoist. He wants this situation, and I genuinely don't know the answer. And this is also, I think, because we've had our correspondence about the Enlightenment here. I think this is also something that definitely pertains to that. That what if we accept these kind of irrational desires? And Stirner, I think, doesn't. If it's true what you say, and I think that you're right in this, that this is some sort of inevitability, then yeah, how does this fit in? What if we don't want to be rational?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I mentioned in my presentation that Stirner on this particular point seems to ignore psychology, where his theory of egoism is based precisely on, I think, a very good analysis of human psychology. He seems to ignore it as far as this is concerned. And the fact is that people get self-enjoyment from all sorts of strange things. And you're not going to be able to stop those things from happening just because you're an enlightened, rational human being, because there are undercurrents in every human mind which may lead one to do things which are in some way or other counterproductive to one's own happiness, ultimately. And Stirner doesn't allow for that. And that's why I mentioned at the end of my presentation about the fact that, as far as I can see, Stirner had this one big idea, which was, hey guys, we all need to cut the crap. And the crap is all of the mythologies that are out there. And he said, he was saying to his readers, those who wanted to listen, that all of these mythologies, these hegemonic mythologies that dominate our lives, are myths. They're fictions, guys. They're made up by human beings. Wake up. Realize all that is left is you there inside yourself, inside your brain, watching this all happen. Let's focus on that rather than dedicating our lives to these fictional institutions or whatever they may be. That was his one big idea. And he didn't think it through like Harari thought it through in saying, Harari says, hey, this is the reality. Man, in order to develop as he develops in a social environment, in order to create great civilizations and so on and so forth, needs these myths. It's how it works. He doesn't think it through like Nietzsche, who said, these myths don't work anymore. What are we going to do about it? Create new myths. That was Nietzsche's, the whole point of Nietzsche's philosophy was to try and discover new myths which were believable. Stirner doesn't do that at all. He says, sweep them all away and we'll be left with the reality. And the reality is each individual self, because that's all you've got.
Yeah, I agree that the ego in its own is definitely imperfect, and there are many ideas in there that are, I think, worth, developing further, which is also why we're here. There's also a small semantic point I wanted to make about the question from David, which is that you ask something about it being apolitical. I think we've answered the question quite well, but if we haven't, then please let us know. But there's also, I think, just an interesting semantic thing with being apolitical. It's that it's like atheism, like it only makes sense in a religious context. So even though you're not religious, there needs to be a religion in order to be atheist. Like, we don't have a word for people that aren't cannibals, because cannibalism isn't something that we do. So in this, so being apolitical is in that sense also a political position, but it's just a semantic point that I wanted to make here, because I'm also not sure what to do with it further, but just to answer your question comprehensively. That's the last thing I wanted to say.
I omitted the part of your question, or Jorn and I omitted to answer the part about the cynics and whether it's a refusal of politics, and it's a good point. But at the same time, I have to say that I don't think it can be directly equated with atheism, even if it were the case, because the fact is that human beings, or at least some human beings, don't need to have God in their lives. They don't need God at all. But you need some sort of political arrangement, whatever that might be. Even if it's an arrangement which says we won't have any arrangements, it's still ultimately political, in a way which atheism is not involved. It simply rejects the supernatural, end of story. And the supernatural doesn't need to play a role, because in most people's lives, certainly in mine, the supernatural never appears. Whereas politics will always appear. Humans live together with other humans, and politics is a part of what goes on. Having said that, certainly for Stirner, irony is incredibly important, and therefore being ironical about the state of political theory at his time is certainly part of what he's doing. But I don't think that he takes politics seriously enough to actually say something like, we or I reject, refuse politics as a whole. I just don't think he goes that far. It's a kind of a gap in his thought, I'm afraid.
Yeah, there's also then the question, of course, what does the word politics mean? Because we seem to, well, we use it, but it's quite difficult to define. And I think, I mean, can there not be politics at all? I mean, we could imagine a world where there's no religion, but can we imagine a world where there's no politics? I think it's a difficult question. And at least in my reading of his work, he observes in his contemporaries that politics becomes something more than what it previously was. It becomes a place for, well, it also takes the place that religion used to have, and these concepts like equality or freedom have the significance of what God used to have. So there's an expansion of politics that, you know, because of the decline of religion, or the recession of religion, perhaps is a better way of putting it. But yeah, that's, you know, it's a difficult point because it's hard to define what politics means to begin with, and if we don't know that, then how can we even fathom being apolitical?
I think you can have a general understanding of politics as in its original definition, coming from the polis, from the city state, where individuals congregate in a polis, and it's the arrangement of those individuals within the polis amongst themselves. So I think if you take that very general definition of politics, it is unavoidable in a way that God is not unavoidable. God is highly avoidable, especially in the modern secular Western world that many of us live in.
Can I ask you then, do you think that chimps have politics or dogs?
No, I don't. And I don't think that they need to have that, because they don't have organization on the same level that humans have organization. So it's quite sufficient for them to have hierarchical or non-hierarchical systems of behavior, which work themselves out in what is called a jungle environment. Human beings have endeavored to go beyond that and to have a far more complex form of organization, which puts in place an infrastructure, and I don't just mean that in terms of irrigation or water pipes or whatever else, an infrastructure which is for the common good, and which the various citizens contribute to, because they realize that it's for the common good. Stirner seems to think that's all going to fall in place when the light bulbs go on in everybody's minds and they realize, hey, we're rational, enlightened human beings, and it's going to be better if we love each other. You know, it's kind of, there's a little bit of hippiness about it, it seems to me.
Okay, I think we're deviating a bit far from the original question, but I do think that chimps have politics. Well, maybe we should save that subject for another time. But I mean, I agree that human politics is more complex, but I think the very same things that are happening here, you know, in the human world, happens in a much simpler way among chimps or bonobos or, you know, similar primates. But I think we shouldn't go further down this route because it's a bit far from the original subject. It's for another time.
I think that's probably an even broader definition of politics than the one I was using, but okay.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question from Cal. Get that.
Yeah. So I'm directing this mostly at Tim in response to some of the things that you've kind of been saying in this discussion period. And my question kind of centers around Stirner's psychology, or how you see it. Because you've used the term like rational self-interest a lot throughout this. And I I'm kind of surprised because I don't really see him as promoting a kind of rational ideal. I think like one of the important criticisms that he has of Bruno Bauer is turning to a kind of thoughtlessness instead of kind of the thoughtful mode of the pure critic that Bauer is trying to set up. And kind of throughout, even like kind of his contemporaries, the official last young Hegelian, Carl Schmitt, he criticized Stirner for basically saying that the unique was not for itself. It doesn't have this kind of like reflexive gesture to it that gives it a sense of unity. It's still this kind of like unstable, amorphous thing a little bit, and even kind of in some of the later writings and like Stirner's critics, Stirner seems to associate this kind of mode of like acting as a unique individual and like encountering other unique things or people with this kind of mode of like losing yourself, or this kind of thoughtless activity of just kind of doing. So I'm wondering in what respect we can say that he's like kind of rational or the unique in this kind of proper egoist sense is like rational.
Yeah, very good question, and a big question. And I would like to take it back to one of the first points you made which was about psychology, about Stirner's psychological acumen. I think the important thing about Stirner's big point is, I think what Stirner's all about is about egoism. And that's the important part of Stirner's psychological analysis of human beings, of human behavior, of why people do the things they do, what their motivation is. Nietzsche quite famously came up with the phrase or the sentence, it is not something worse to the effect. It's not the loved one that you love, but the process of loving. So that you love somebody else because you enjoy loving somebody else. And Stirner's analysis of human motivation was such that he said, we are all missing the point that what we do is based in self-interest. Now, I differ on this point to David Leopold. I don't know if you guys have read the introduction to Leopold's edition of The Ego and Its Own. But he is of the opinion that Stirner should be perhaps considered as an ethical egoist. For me, Stirner is very clearly a psychological egoist. Psychological egoism was quite a new idea in Stirner's time, and I think that it is the best way of explaining Stirner's particular form of egoism. And that is the point that is important about Stirner's psychology. That's what he does well. On other aspects of psychology, he doesn't do well at all, in my opinion. And, he doesn't seem to identify sort of Freudian divisions of ego, superego, and id, or anything like that. He doesn't envisage such a thing. Which is why I use the word rational, because he seems to see the human brain as operating on one level, which is a vast oversimplification. In the meantime, we know, I think one can say that we know that even the notion of identity is a fiction. And there are all sorts of people who are aware of this simply because they realize that they are living with multiple identities in their own heads. But the reality is that the identity of any individual is changing so rapidly that to talk of identity is actually absurd. So I think on the subject of reason, certainly Stirner would say that reason shouldn't be turned into a sacred idea. So he rejects, to a certain extent, the Enlightenment concept of reason as a sacred idea, most certainly. And that's something that Jorn and I think, have spoken about before. The part of the Enlightenment which he adopts with gusto is the part of the Enlightenment which is in relation to the eradication of dogma. And that's what he dedicates himself to. And his big idea is that that dogma is covering up our true egoistic motivations. We need to get rid of the dogma in order to be able to concentrate on ourselves and realize where our self-enjoyment really comes from. As for the thoughtless activity, which is a very, very interesting point, and it's something which needs textual analysis, which I haven't really done. I think that my interpretation of thoughtless activity is Stirner saying, don't allow yourself to be subjugated to the tyranny of thoughts, to the tyranny of those thoughts that rely on language which is already so overloaded with implications that you can't escape from them. So that's why thoughtlessness, I think, or at least one reason why thoughtlessness plays a role in the way that he thinks the egoists should behave. And I know that, I think you, at least I think, I don't know, but I think that Jorn and I have discussed it as well. So I think Jorn may well have something that he'd like to add about the thoughtlessness idea.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on the subject of psychological egoism. But there is certainly, especially the section on involuntary egoism, that is, of course, very interesting in many ways. And one that he seems to recognize that egoism leads to non-egoism, or certainly a desire for it. So, I mean, I have to then, I mean, I don't want to repeat myself, but of course, there's the same question of, you know, what if someone like Feuerbach wants this? You know, what if he rejects egoism? And then it seems that he has, I mean, he has some crude understanding of these of the subconscious, but it's not very developed, because clearly the people like Feuerbach or Bauer or Marx would not consider themselves egoists, even though Stirner says, okay, but what you're doing comes out of egoism. It's just that they don't recognize it in themselves, and so if they did it consciously out of egoism, then we would at least have some indication of it. Yeah. So I think oh, sorry, I wanted to say, I think he addresses a certain tension that exists within the psyche that leads to these sort of contradictions. That's the last thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can only agree with what you're saying, and add that it seems to me that this is part of the gap in his thinking, that he doesn't actually, he identifies behavior as being motivated by self-interest. Fine, fair enough. But he doesn't go where that takes you, or at least all the places where that can take you. He doesn't look at those motivations which might be considered perverse. For example, take, you know, the masochist who likes being beaten. How does that fit into the picture? He just doesn't go there. He doesn't talk about that. You know, the great thing about the work of Nietzsche is that it's so extensive. He covers just about everything. With Stirner, we're left guessing, because he gave us one book. He gave some short answers to his critics, and that's about it. And we just don't know anymore. And yeah, my kind of take on it is, what I've already said 16 times, the big idea. He had this big idea, he expressed the big idea in a way which I think is relatively clear, but he didn't look into the implications and repercussions of that big idea very, very successfully.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up?
Yes, we do. No, go ahead.
Well, so I also I agree that Stirner has elements of like a psychological egoism, but I'm not sure if that's the primary kind of egoism. I think that that might just be a consequence. And I think of 2 points on this. First is both in Stirner's critics. First is when he's responding to Feuerbach's objection to him about gender in the brain, when he says that you are more than a man, but you're also like more than your brain, your organ, you know. He seems to not purely identify like kind of yourself as unique with just your brain, you know. So there's I think one kind of key problem there, at least with just a purely psychological view of his egoism. But then also secondly, earlier in Stirner's critics, when he's talking about like Feuerbach, Hess, Seglia, I think that's how you say it, he says that they are egoists not because they're like self-interestedly motivated, but because they are at the center of their own worlds. You know, I almost call it like kind of existential egoism. It's that everything exists for you in relation to you as you're the centerpiece of it, rather than there being this kind of like positive motivation out towards the world. I think that comes out of that prior centrality. Does that make sense?
Well, first of all, I should clarify what I meant by psychological egoism is that egoism is generally divided into 3 types. Psychological egoism, ethical egoism, and rational egoism. And the difference between the 3 forms of egoism is, well, there are lots of differences, but one of the main differences is that the latter 2 are normative forms of egoism. Mm-hmm. So ethical egoism says that it's the right thing to do to act in your own self-interest. And rational egoism says it's the reasonable thing to do, it's the rational thing to do to act in your own self-interest. Psychological egoism says whether we like it or not, that's the way our brains work. So I wasn't using psychological egoism in order somehow to combine psychology with egoism. I was using it in this specific sense. I think when Stirner responds to his critics, be it Seliger or whomsoever, and accuses them of, or tells them that they're at the center, that they're egoists without knowing it or whatever, that's very much a reflection of what is known as psychological egoism. In other words, whether we like it or not, we are at bottom egoists. And that explains involuntary egoism, because you don't realize that what you're doing perhaps is because you like it. You may even imagine in your mind that you're doing it for wonderful, sacred, altruistic motives, but ultimately you're doing it because you want to do it. And then, you know, you get down to the discussion which always comes up on psychological egoism of how is the behavior of the war hero egoistic. And there are perfectly good explanations for it. I don't think we need to go into it now, but anyway, that's the form of egoism that I believe Stirner meant, and that's why he can apply the term egoistic to everybody, because ultimately that's what he believes human motivation is based on. Mm-hmm. And of course, the development that has happened in biology since then, most specifically in Darwinian biology, and even more specifically in Dawkins' neo-Darwinism, I think it's called, where, especially in his book, The Selfish Gene, underlines that Stirner is absolutely right. We are motivated to work in our own selfish, and I don't mean that in the negative sense, I mean it in the general sense of the self, in our own selfish interests, because that's our biological programming. And ultimately, our biological programming is the most fundamental programming that we have. Sorry, I'm speaking too much.
Well, you're here to speak, I think, and I think at least I like to listen to what you have to say. But I think what you say, Cal, there's also a certain interesting aspect to it, and so this what you describe as existential egoism, I think is very interesting, and it doesn't necessarily exclude psychological egoism, because I don't think Tim entirely agrees with this, but I read Stirner as an early existentialist, or I mean, I think he's just an existentialist, not particularly early, at least not earlier than Kierkegaard. Anyway, I think these are separate issues. And there's a psychological egoism that whatever I do, even though I think I do it for some higher good, I ultimately do it for me. And then there's this existential egoism, as you describe it, which is that in Sartrean terms, we are thrown into the world, and then we have to figure it out from this specific situation, rather than having this sort of external idealist view that the Hegelians or the Fichteans or those people would like to have, or scientists for that matter, that we find ourselves in this very unique world historical situation, and from that perspective, we try to make sense of it. And I think in that sense, he does also use the term egoism, and I really do often wish that he was a bit clearer in his language.
I'd just like to add, if I may, that I'm really looking forward to the 3rd annual Stirner Symposium, where Jorn and I will go head to head on Stirner as an existentialist. I look forward to that.
Oh, absolutely. Me too. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I'll get ready for it.
Well, there are a few more questions, but we've hit our time for today. So perhaps, if people could reach out to you via email to ask those questions, maybe. But I'd just like to once again thank our presenters, Dr. Jorn Janssen and Tim Dowdall. We're going to reconvene for our 3rd panel, Abstraction and Ontology, tomorrow the 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern, where we'll hear from Adam Jones on the labor of abstraction and David McCullough on ontological anarchism, moderated by Jacob Bernstein. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, please
Thank you,
share
Tim.
any contact information for the people in the chat to follow up with you on those questions.